Hi, I'm Shannon Kniff, and with Pete Seidel, co-chair ASBPA's Best Restored Shores Award Committee. And today, I'm facilitating this session composed from this year's winners. Our aim is to inspire you to pursue superior shoreline restoration projects, ones that we hope you or someone else will nominate for national recognition as a Best Restored Shore. By acting on the tips you hear today, you will be helped well along the way. But first, a bit on the award itself. 2 years ago, ASBPA created this Best Restored Shores Award, and our intent is basically to honor stellar shoreline restoration projects, to build awareness of the value of restoring our coasts in ways that help them become climate change resilient and that benefit ecosystems and communities. Through this award, we seek to acknowledge the hard work that goes into building partnerships and securing adequate funding, to recognize the scientific and engineering skills that are needed to design and construct these projects, and to encourage the transfer of information on the benefits that are realized from the projects. All of this with the aim of encouraging expanded implementation of more superior restoration endeavors. Today's session is just one of the avenues that we're using to share these successes. Look for an article in our journal Shore and Beach really soon. But before we dive in, let me say a few words about what kinds of projects are eligible for the Best Restored Shores Award. All projects should address enhancing ecological and community resilience to sea level rise, erosion, flooding, or storm surge. Eligible projects are those located on moderate and low energy shorelines, such as coastal back bays, large freshwater lakes, and even urbanized waterfronts. Projects can involve restoration of intertidal or subtidal habitats. They can include wetlands, mangroves, seagrass, shellfish, or coral reefs. Easy for you to say. Living shorelines and hybrid designs that use natural materials or otherwise deploy nature-based tactics are also eligible, as are those that use dredged material beneficially to enhance environmental outcomes. Finally, I want you to know that applying for the award is actually pretty easy. You could probably, if you were involved in a project, pull the necessary information together off the top of your head. So look for our call for nominations next spring, probably in April. So now, let's turn to our speakers. Today you will hear from the leaders of the 3 winning teams, Captain Alec Majeski, Douglas Janik, and Dr. Jennifer Matei. After all 3 speak, I will lead a discussion, like a panel discussion, to try to tease out some additional issues and lessons learned. After that, we will open up to you, the audience, for questions and comments. So please save up your questions for the end of the session. First, we're going to hear from Captain Alec Majeski about his Cook's Beach project in New Jersey. And I think you're really going to love his drone footage. And it really illustrates how a video can tell an incredibly powerful story. Over to you, Alec.
Hi, everybody. My name is Captain Al Majeski. I'm the Habitat Restoration Program Director for the American Little Society. On behalf of the Society, I want to thank the ASBPA for awarding us this recognition of one of the best restored shorelines in the United States for 2020. We really appreciate it. I kind of want to tell you a little bit about the story of Cook's Beach and how that work that you're recognizing us for helped us restore habitat and improve community connectivity and resiliency. For those of you that don't know the American Little Society, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We're headquartered out of Sandy Hook in New Jersey, and we care for the coast and empower others to care for the coast, and we do that through education, advocacy, as well as through restoration and conservation. In Delaware Bay, where Cook's Beach is actually located, if you look in the upper left photo here, you can see Cook's Beach is in Cape May County, New Jersey. It's one of 8 or 9 beaches that we've restored so far in Delaware Bay since Superstorm Sandy. We've restored over 75 acres of beach habitat for the horseshoe crab and for the federally enlisted red knot and other shorebirds. We've also built over about 8 now. We have 8 more planned intertidal oyster reefs, so about 3,210 linear feet of these oyster reefs, which you see in the bottom picture. These are for keeping sand on the beach, basically, and accreting sand and helping our beaches to minimize the erosion, so we can keep that habitat for the horseshoe crab and the habitat for the foraging shorebirds. We've tagged quite a few crabs, as you can see here, and now we have in place an Army Corps regional 10-year permit that allows us to do the beach, the vegetated berm, as well as the reef work in Cape May and Cumberland counties over the next 10 years. We're currently working on the same type of permit, a blanket permit with the state of New Jersey that allows us to do the same work for the next 5 years. So why Cook's Beach? Well, for those of you that aren't familiar with Delaware Bay and Cook's Beach and that complex, Cook's Beach is a feeder beach. A feeder beach is a source beach. So when we put sand on Cook's Beach, that sand goes to adjacent beaches and kind of leaves Cook's Beach alone. We want to keep sand on the beach. We've added sand in Cook's Beach multiple times. And what it has done, like I said, it moves to adjacent beaches, but it's also formed these really awesome shoals. These shoals have become excellent habitat for horseshoe crab spawning and foraging shorebirds. But now we want to keep that sand also in Cook's, because Cook's is the center of the Reed's Cook's Pierce's Point Beach complex. This beach is really important to crabs. It's important to shorebirds. The entire complex is important for the fact that in 2019, 29,000 of the 31,000 red knots, the federally listed red knots, fattened up on our restored beaches in that complex of 31,000. So that was about 98.5%. So how do we do it? Well, our strategy is pretty simple. We build reefs, we restore beaches, and then we vegetate berms behind that beach. And I'm going to show you kind of how we do build these reefs. This is a 5th annual celebration. Part of our restoration work is also outreach and engaging the community. And fortunately, in 2019, we were still able to have volunteer events, whereas in 2020, we were not due to COVID restrictions in our state. For this, I'm going to go ahead and press play, and we are going to hope that it works, and it should. And you could also see the shoals in that picture of where the sand had gone. So here you go. Welcome to Cook's Beach, everybody. It's celebration time. We did this on August 10th, 2019, with about 80 to 85 volunteers. And you're going to see all this kind of unfold as we go. The vision at Cook's Beach was to create 3 double road reefs, what you see behind me in the picture here, but 3 of those, and that would protect the beach. So here we go, enjoy. All our reefs have been hand built in Delaware Bay, just so you know. And you can see we stake out our reefs in segments, like the picture you see behind me, these stakes, so we know which way this kind of double road sawtooth formation goes. There's 5-foot gaps in each reef. That allows, between each segment, that allows the horseshoe crabs to move in and also move out, as well as other estuarine species. And here you can see all the beautiful shoals that have formed here because of the restoration work that's been done at Cook's Beach. This is prime horseshoe crab and shorebird habitat. And you can see we've done this through fireman's chains. We use skiffs. We also have an amphibious vehicle that we use to get the shell out. And one of my favorite things is, as you see in the corner here, the white van pulling up. That's Spanky's barbecue. He'll set up and provide food and drinks for everybody that helped out. So after we're done working at the celebration, we celebrate again with some barbecue. You can really see how these structures start attenuating the waves. And there's all our volunteers.
Thank you, Captain Al. Now, let's hear from Doug Janik, who's going to tell us his team's story of GANDY'S Beach Preserve, also in New Jersey. The creativity of his presentation is likely a reflection of his innovation in the field. Have fun with this.
On behalf of Sovereign Consulting, its field crew, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Nature Conservancy, thank you for this award and thank you for this conference. Gandy's Beach has many tales. I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you one of them. So please get comfortable and enjoy this tale. Gandy's Beach is located in the Delaware Bay region, along the New Jersey Bay shore. It's somewhat a remote site, being a quarter mile from any vehicular access. About 30 years ago, the site consisted of a marsh, a band of beach, back marsh, and two back marsh channels coming out, one to the north and one to the south of the site. By 2016, most of the marsh and beach area had eroded away. The two channels were either plugged naturally or relocated. All that was left was a small tombolo structure. For the better part of a decade, this tombolo feature remained somewhat consistent. Even after Ida in 2009 and Sandy in 2012, both of which had direct impacts on this site, tombolo still remained somewhat persistent. It wasn't until around that 2016 that this feature started to erode again at rapid rates. This erosion occurred at the head or the island, at the intertidal sandbar, which is called the neck of the tombolo, and the body or the mainland. All areas were getting eroded much more rapidly, especially the neck area. During the same time, 2 rows of Oyster Castle breakwaters were installed on either side of the tombolo. The purpose of these was to create oyster habitat as well as protect the shoreline of the beach from erosion. In 2016, topographic monitoring data was being collected throughout the preserve. Some of that data was collected in the vicinity of the site. We began noticing some significant erosion near the mainland. However, there was a data gap. Not the entire site was being monitored. So the monitoring grid was expanded in 2017. The 2017-2018 data set still identified significant erosion occurring along the marsh edge and portions of the tombolo neck. However, the outer portions of the tombolo seem to be accreting sediments. The 2018-2019 data set depicted the entire tombolo area being eroded. The limited amount of accretion shown during 2017 to 2018 appeared to only be a temporary condition. The 2017-2019 dataset clearly indicated that the Oyster Castle breakwaters were not performing as expected. An adaptive measure was needed. This photograph was taken at extreme low tide. It shows the extensive erosion along the marsh edge. It also shows the adjacent portion of the tombolo neck, also being eroded at an accelerated rate. As the tombolo degrades, its ability to protect the marsh behind it and the shorelines nearby is also reduced. As a result, during high energy conditions, the marsh in the mainland begins to degrade rapidly as well. At the project site, you can see massive toe cutting within the marsh. In some situations, this toe cutting exceeds 4 feet in depth. One of the challenges of this project was the inconsistent and accelerating rate of erosion of this tombolo feature. If you look at the picture, the shaded areas had sandbars in May of 2019. When we got to November of 2019, these areas were eroded away. This type of energy in this video was somewhat commonplace. It was at this point Sovereign was asked to come in to evaluate the erosion occurring at the tombolo. Focused wave modeling and vector analyses were performed. The analyses identified energy focal points that were occurring at different periods along the tidal cycle. These energy focal points corresponded with the erosion patterns observed on site. The solution to this problem was to create a situation that would disrupt these energy flows and directions during normal synchronic conditions and during storm events. The concept that was developed involved the creation of an oyster castle spine that would be constructed along the footprint of the sandbar neck that was eroding rapidly. In addition, entry points or gaps where the energy was entering into this area would receive linear subtidal shellback structures to help break up currents and waves as well. Working together, this was a wave dampening design as well as a current disrupting design. This allows for accretion to occur on either side of the spine depending on which direction energy was coming from on a given event. After some modifications to design and some on-the-ground adjustments, the final as-built condition is shown on the sketch. So now let's take a look at really what happened out there.
Well, that's all I have to say for now. There's more to be written at Gandy's Beach. Thank you for listening.
Okay, now let's move on to Dr. Jennifer Mattei, who will be speaking about the Stratford Point project in Connecticut.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Mattei, and I am a professor at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. I'm going to talk to you today about the coastal restoration work that I do. But first, I just wanted to thank the awards committee of the ASBPA for all their hard work and for honoring our projects. Really brings them into the limelight and help, making people more aware that there are nature-based solutions out there to some of our climate change problems. And today, specifically, I'm going to take you to a place along the Housatonic River in Long Island Sound. And so to begin with, I have to get my computer to advance. So living shoreline versus seawalls. Many of you know seawalls are very bad for beaches, and most shorelines erode away when revetments and seawalls are put in. And the vegetation only, or vegetation and maybe a core log, sometimes will work in upper embayments, but it doesn't work very well in areas where you have a lot of wave energy. So we've been working with the idea of trying to find a way to break the waves, allow sediments to settle rather than erode, and allow for the marsh grasses and other parts of the coastal vegetation shoreline to come back after being eroded. So these projects, particularly the larger ones, need to have a good team of a variety of different backgrounds. So you need a restoration ecologist, so sort of my position on this project. You need someone who understands the physical ocean and either environmental engineer or physical oceanographer. And you need advice, at least from landscape architects, to make the site appealing to your public audience as well. So it definitely requires teamwork, and you need to know the history of the site, what habitats used to be there, what habitats might be able to be brought back, any sort of physical changes that may prevent restoration from occurring, and how to deal with it. So it's important to look nearby, so you can use nearby shorelines as a reference that maybe haven't undergone such erosion, and see what native plants are surviving relatively close by. So these are complex systems at the mouth of this particular river, the Housatonic River. During a storm, you can have water rushing down into the sound. During nor'easters or hurricane events, you can have wave forces coming into the shoreline, and then you can get downshore movement and scouring all along the shoreline. So it's quite an interactive site in terms of water movement. Quick history was that this site was originally owned by Remington Arms. It was a gun club contaminated with tons and tons of lead shot. And so a long and processed remediation took place, taking out the marsh because it was loaded with lead and infecting the wildlife, contaminating the wildlife. And so after remediation, they tried to put the marsh back. It was eaten by geese and washed away. And then, it was thought that since erosion is continuing, they lost several feet of shoreline, that they would try to engineer a shoreline by using geotubes, plastic kind of a polymer that they buried into the shoreline and then covered it with organic mix and then planted beach grass. And the idea was to hope that the vegetation would hold the shoreline with the underlying engineered structure. Several hurricanes later, including Irene and Sandy, had other ideas for that shoreline, and it simply did not work. Upstream from us, where no remediation had occurred, the marsh grasses were eroding away as well. You can see here the peat was stripped of the grasses, and this is just occurring every winter. Typical winter nor'easters will come up and strip the vegetation away, and sea level rise. It's risen several inches over the past 40 years, and that has its cost and erosion. So when I did my research on the site, going back, what is missing are the oyster reefs. And I'm talking reefs, not just beds. And these reefs would protect the marsh and protect the shoreline from wave activity. So we decided to try putting in something that would break the waves. And we heard about these reef balls down in Florida that people were using to bring back coral reefs after hurricanes. So we decided to try using them to bring back oyster reefs. And so we put in 150 feet. The landowner, Corteva Agriscience, it used to be DuPont, wanted to really try doing this. And so we installed 150 feet using tractors to pass the reef balls down, and then they would run across boards so that they wouldn't dig up the substrate at all. So the benthic area was good. We had volunteers help us planting and students, and this is a picture showing how the waves break on the reef, slow that water down, and trickle through the grasses, and sediments began falling out, so much so that we had 6 inches in the first 18 months. And the grasses were growing in quite well after that. So we applied for permits to expand the reef system, and we followed the natural contours of the sediments, and we left gaps, which ended up being a very important aspect of the project, between reef lines and overlap the ends so you don't get scour around the end. And so in this way, it allows tidal exchange. The water comes in and goes back out, and it prevents any erosion that might occur around the in-between lines of the reef. So this worked well. We planted additional grasses. This is putting in, using the same technique, just swinging the reef balls down from the upper shoreline and putting them in place at low tide. And we had several Earth Days where we had people come out and planted 10,000 or more plugs of salt marsh grass, and grew in very well. However, it's not all sunshine, because we ended up with having a lot of erosion occurring at the high tide line where those old geotubes were. And when they're exposed to UV radiation, they break down and cause problems with entanglement of wildlife, and they even can break down and put microplastics into the water. So it's a real problem. The landowner didn't want to pull them up because he spent so much money putting them down. So we had to find a way to try to cover them up. So we put in to try for building a high marsh, or restoring the high marsh, using imported mulch from Seafood House and artificial rack. We tied down trees with root wads on them with steel cable, and brought in sand and gravel, and then covered the geotubes over, and had the students planting, helping me plant high marsh grasses, salt marsh grasses. And so it all worked well for the first year. But in New England and the states in the northern areas, we have pretty high tides, and During the winter, you know, it can be 7 to 8 feet tidal range. And also during the winter, this particular winter, we had 4 nor'easters. And again, we had a lot of erosion. Materials come down the river like this. I don't know where this came from a dock or something that was ruined. And so materials can come in and smash into the shoreline. But in this game, adaptive management is needed. You have to try something else. So we tried using core logs, but use them rolled up with shells. So they're much heavier and they hold much better when they're tied down and with oak stakes. And I found a material from the Netherlands that is used, they're called Bessie elements, but they're made out of potato starch. And they snap together like Legos, and you can get the plants to grow through them, and they will slowly biodegrade. So we thought we'd give it a try because the site was so problematic, and we were able to get the plants to grow through them. And we ended up with this lasting for now. We're going into our 3rd winter, and it seems to be all holding together right now. So we're trying to really buy time and plan for inundation. And we have established oysters. And this year, blue mussels came in with the oysters. So we have a true shellfish reef forming. And so we're hoping that we're allowing also some room for the marsh to migrate up the shoreline. So as sea levels rise, there's room for it to become established. And we also put in dunes that are mounded. And so when you get a storm, the water comes up and around them and back out. So it doesn't form a wall, but it forms a place for the water to go and back out. So we ended up developing some mud flats, some cobble areas. The high marsh is slowly developing, and here's some data on our oyster reef establishment. The oysters are really coming in on the sections that are further or deeper out, and those sections are only going to get deeper as time goes on, and the oysters will survive better. And you don't have to necessarily use oyster reefs. You can use oyster castles, wave attenuating devices. Reef Maker has some devices, or even if you already have a hard substrate along your harbor, you can put in ecocrete, which can form tide pools and things like that. So not only that, the main point sort of completely that I want to make is that you need multiple habitats. So we not only did we put in dunes, but we had, you know, pollinator meadows and grasslands and even a small area of coastal forests. So we put in to increase biodiversity, and these habitats have synergistic effects on each other. These also restorations have to have some type of adaptive management plan over time. Some maintenance is going to be needed every year. Invasive species are always problematic. And so, you know, before restoration, we had a flat and barren and vulnerable site. And after restoration, we have habitat structure, biodiversity, and resiliency. So we already went through our first tropical storm this year, and the reef and grasses did really well. So I'd like to just thank all of my coworkers. I definitely don't do this alone, and most definitely my hard workers, the undergraduates and my students who work with me, and numerous grant funding agencies and supporters like Audubon Connecticut and Nature Conservancy. And I'd like to thank you for your attention.
So now we're at the part of the session where we're going to have the 3 award winners talk amongst themselves, because I was hoping that we'd be able to tease out some information that each of them might be able to share together to give you all a better picture of what it takes to do these kinds of projects and what they've learned. So my first question to all of you guys is that town planners, local development boards, regulating agencies, and even the public, provide comments on projects and, weigh in. So, and they don't always understand natural infrastructure projects, or they, of course, have their own particular worry or angle to things. So I'm wondering if you could share with us what sort of policy changes or regulatory flexibility would help future natural infrastructure types of projects or climate resilience projects in general, how they might proceed more efficiently, lower cost, quicker, whatever, in the future. Alec, I'll turn it over to you first to respond.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, that's a good question. And, New Jersey, I can only speak for New Jersey, we've come a long way. The regulators have become partners. We still follow the regulatory rules and things like that, but we're actually involved now in changing them, developing them to make them more restoration centric. A couple cases, in this is we have regional permits now and blanket permits to do this, to do the work. So like Cook's Beach with the living shoreline component and the oyster reef piece, as well as adding sand to the beach for the horseshoe crab and the red knot, we can do that for the next 10 years. And at any beach in Cumberland or Cape May counties through the Army Corps permit. And we got together with the state too, and things are changing, and they work together with us to create this regional blanket permit, same type of permit. So that kind of makes it more effective and more efficient for us to do the work and try to get, and not like, I guess, stress everybody out that we're in such a rush because the horseshoe crabs are coming. We got to get the sand down and all this. Now we can better time it out and kind of prioritize what we like. And it also gives us a dance card for funding.
Jennifer, did you have any experiences or thoughts about this?
Sure. In Connecticut, the state process has been streamlined. So they're very interested in getting living shorelines on the ground. Everyone's been talking about them and planning, and nothing, it was very slow to get going. But once we had our project going, it was great. The only issue we had was among the numerous federal agencies all wanting to weigh in and all having their pet projects, so if we put back the marsh on gravel, where will the sturgeon feed? Well, we don't have sturgeon in the Housatonic River, so that it was like thinking of future problems to slow the project down. And then the town had its own concerns, what if boats run into the reef? What if, there's all these different safety issues. And I felt like if we could all get in one room together, it would be easier. But instead, I was going from one office to the next, and particularly the federal group, if they had all been together, it would have been easier or faster, to get all the questions answered, things like that.
Yeah, good points and good advice perhaps for our federal colleagues. Doug, how about you? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, one of the things that we do with all these new living shoreline projects is that a lot of the work is somewhat innovative, and we have designers and implementers, we do this all the time in different states, a lot of different techniques and tactics. A lot of regulators don't have that exposure or that experience. So a big part of any of these projects is outreach education, not just to the public, but to the regulators as well. And a great policy would be for them to be a little more proactive with that, because usually what I'm finding is that we have to do the heavy lifting to educate them, either through the permit process or if we're lucky even before the permit, but usually it's during the permit processing where a lot of education occurs. But there are workshops and there are forums that they can attend that are even usually pretty local to where they're located. It's not a big travel issue. If they can try to keep up with the technology as well, not wait for a project to come up, because the gut reaction, if you don't understand it, you don't want to support it. So if the more they know, the more up to speed they can become on the technology, the better off the project is, because the permitting, it'll be a better permanent and more informed permitting issuance.
Yeah, on that note, I'd just like to say involve them early and often. One of the things that we've done with all our projects is we brought on, or they brought on us on, or we brought them on, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a partner. This is really helping out on some of the permitting of projects that we need to find out. For instance, doing a pilot right now to see how the structures, these oyster reefs, are going to hold up in the nor'easters. You know, and because Fish and Wildlife Service is a partner on this project, it becomes a priority project. And that helps expedite the permitting through the Army Corps, as well as helping us involve the state quickly too.
You mentioned sturgeon, and I wonder if all of you have had an experience where, not to pick on one agency, but you know, for any agency, do they look to the future, or are they only concerned about current impacts? You know, I mean, are they taking into account that they may be losing vital habitat as a result of sea level rise and erosion?
Yeah, I think that they are there. What my issue was I'm more ecology ecosystem approach, and they were a single species approach. And that was an issue because we were actually restoring marsh that had been there. And, you know, so there was some mudflat and some gravelly substrate that they were concerned about. And we were saying, you know, but overall, the marsh was here. We're not putting in new habitat. We're restoring what once was there. And so there is a debate, you know, if one person thinks we should be using boulders instead of reef balls because they saw fish hanging out under boulders in the sound. Well, you know, if they had come by during Hurricane Sandy, they would have seen those boulders being thrown into the air, you know. So I would never use boulders because they move, you know. And but I mean, so those are, like you were saying, education issues. If they were up on sort of the latest techniques, and it would be easier going forward. But they are looking, they look to the past and to the future, but it is a difficult balance when they're species oriented.
Alec, it looked like you might have had a point there you wanted to raise.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, we're all evolving, you know, and I want to say for us in New Jersey, at least since Hurricane Sandy, it's really not tailored to construction as much. We're starting to grow in this restoration push for using natural infrastructure. New Jersey is big on resiliency right now. We're looking at climate change. We're looking ahead, you know, for 2050, 2100. What do we need to do now that's going to become more programmatic in a way, you know, and we're learning language. I think one of the things that's always happened to us is the definition of things and how it's interpreted across agencies and how I might interpret it. So one of our stumbling blocks, which we got through with the agencies, was what is an impaired marsh? What's your definition of an impaired marsh? Ecologically impaired, vertically impaired, as you go through all these different things to say, do you even need to do a restoration here? And we've learned through all that, and some of the processes too have like I said, it's an evolution and been very positive here in New Jersey so far.
That's really fascinating. Doug, your perspective, you're in a different state?
Well, I work in the whole Mid-Atlantic, so I see a lot of perspectives, which is really nice. On the federal agencies, a lot of the same characters will play in different states. States agencies where you see the big differences. And I think one of the things that we need to overcome a lot on the federal level is there's a lot of, you have one permit somewhere where you give comments of a similar issue, you give response, you resolve that. Then you go to the next project and the same issues. It's like these same people have never even addressed the issue before, when they're like within a year prior to that had exactly the same discussions on another project. We're not seeing growth. We're seeing the same old comments, the same old thing, and they tend to react on the physical element of the project, not the net benefit. Now, in some cases, they have to. That's how they have to review projects, at least initially. But when you look at the holistic project, say you're doing a hybrid shoreline, they're looking at the structure of the hybrid, not looking at the benefit of the actual project through the whole shoreline profile from subtitle to supertitle. That's been a challenge with some agencies. And other agencies, you know, like the Fish and Wildlife in New Jersey, you know, I work with them too. They're excellent. They're proactive. they're looking forward, they're willing to try things, which is a big step for a federal agency, because they want to see it done, and then once it's done, they want to stick with that same tactic. Fish and Wildlife is much more open-minded, much more progressive, and they're a really fun group to work with. So I think that's a real big part of it. We need to have our agencies, again, educate and grow with the technology, not just stay in one static one point. And I do see that.
It sounds like maybe one of the positive outcomes from COVID and the use of all of these new, platforms and conferences like this, where it's virtual, will allow agencies that have very limited training budgets and even more limited travel budgets to spread their wings a little bit. So, maybe that's one of the silver linings out of all of this.
Yeah, and it's not meant to beat up on the agencies. Part of the problem too, some agencies have their people reviewing the projects, involved in the projects, also the people who are doing other projects, and they're the people getting their hands dirty. Other agencies will have people who are involved in the permit process, but they're not the ones doing the research and studies. There's other groups that don't necessarily talk to one another. So it's not the agency as a whole. Sometimes it's the structure. Sometimes it can be individuals. Sometimes it can be how things have been done for 20 years until certain people leave. And there's a lot of turnovers. This is all fluid. There have been times that, this for a long time, been times when one agency has been real tough to work with. And then all of a sudden now, this next generation, they're very easy to work with, and vice versa. They go through cycles. So, so you really can't say, this is a bad agency, this is a good agency, this is a bad person, good person. It's a dynamic, fluid situation, but it's a constant you have to keep working. Right now, with the new generation coming in, we have a lot of, the baby boomers retiring. People with all this experience are walking away from their career. Now these younger people coming in, and they have a huge learning curve ahead of them. Some of them really want to be involved with that curve, other ones don't. So it's going to be very regional, how well an agency works with another person.
Well, these were incredibly helpful remarks, and I know that others will benefit from these lessons. And so thank you for sharing them. I'd like to switch gears just a little bit. And this may be a little bit of soul bearing on your part. But if you could roll back the hands of time, what is it that you would wish that you had done differently, or had known about, or had considered, more carefully when you were designing or constructing your project? Like lessons learned that you could share with other people, so that maybe they could not do that themselves or do it a little faster. Jennifer, you want to kick this one off?
Sure. So before I got involved at Stratford Point, to the level I am now, a bunch of engineers were hired to put in a artificial dune system using geotextiles and geomembranes and geotubes. And since all of this installation, it was in 2011 and 12, the shoreline has receded back to the point where it's hitting this material. And now there's just this huge mess of non-biodegradable materials that break down under UV radiation. And you couldn't believe the problems we're having. So now trying to do nature-based solutions, we're dealing with this other, what once was thought was a miracle fabric, has nowhere, sort of no way should it be used on a coastline, just in my experience. So that's, if we could turn back time, I wish I was more vocal and said, don't use that. But that was the standard at the time. It was, hold the shoreline, hold that line, don't let it pass. And now we have basically walls of plastic. So that's the biggest problem we have right now that I wish we could change.
Well, that materials question is a tough one. When you're trying to put something together that's going to stay long enough, and that maybe natural materials will break down too fast, and plastic doesn't break down fast enough in a natural way that's beneficial to the environment. So we definitely need to think through maybe the sustainability of the materials and what are the right choices there. So Doug, do you have some comments to share on this point?
Yes, specifically with the site we just worked on, where we had a 6-month window between when we actually went out to site, assessed it, and did design to when we implemented the project. And we knew from past data that we had a rate of erosion occurring out there, and we factored that in. But when we got out there, we didn't realize that rate of erosion was accelerating. So we're actually dealing with deeper water, and it had a big impact on how we had to install and when we could install and who we could use to install the project. So we had to really reassess the first couple of days on how we're going to build the project, on a daily basis. If we went out there a week or two before we did the installation and reassessed that, we would have known that in advance, and we could have pre-planned a little better for that. So we could have really increased our efficiencies. And another big part too is that when you come out to site and you can't do things exactly what you plan on doing, that can have an impact on morale. And when people know they're going to be out on the site for 4 or 5 weeks installing something by hand, and they're having such struggle the first couple of days because we had surprises we weren't expecting, that can have a big impact on their psyche. So, and also that can affect safety and everything else. So lessons learned is basically a pre-construction recon to make sure the changes at the site haven't been significant enough where it's going to affect how you plan on installing a project.
So you raise a really interesting question, and morale of the folks that are installing these projects. I recall from several of the applications descriptions of volunteers and students up to their, chests in water, sometimes really cold water. Is there anything that you've done there to help marshal the troops, so to speak, and keep them enthused that y'all might suggest? Alec, I know you've done a lot of these projects.
Yeah, we use volunteers for about everything. And since COVID, we haven't been able to use volunteers at all. One thing is to limit the time. So if we have an event, it's maybe 4 hours tops. If it's heavy lifting, maybe 3 hours for that event. And like Doug, we have to work around the tides in Delaware Bay for sure when we're building reefs. And then the timing of these things. And then, we're doing something in the summer, say in Barnegat Bay, we don't want to do it when the greenheads are out, and we don't want to do it when the clinging jellyfish might sting them. So we have to figure better times of when to do this to keep them engaged. And that's kind of where we are, with these projects. And we have people that are dedicating, come back, hundreds of people a year, to do these projects. We hope to get them back soon, and that we can do this again, because it also puts a damper on the fact that we leverage that in-kind service for grant funding match. And we don't have that component now. And that's been a big one for us to kind of figure out how we can do how can we do it a little bit differently to get some of that in-kind match and those kind of services as well. I wanted to say flexibility too, and always offer them food. Give them food at the end. That's what we do. We give them barbecue and they're pretty happy at that. So it becomes, for us, we call it a celebration. They enjoy that. They have fun, they do some reef work, and then after that, we all celebrate.
Jennifer, did you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I did. We have either Earth Day events or Party for the Planet is a new way that they're calling it now, where we're involving local aquaria and zoos, any members of these different associations, and particularly Audubon. We have volunteers that come in. And again, one year we had a local brewery come by and offer their select brews, but I didn't allow them to pull it out till everyone planted at least 1,000 plugs of Spartina.
Yeah, right.
So that worked out really well. But yeah, so I've held 1 or 2 day event. You can't go very long, as Alec was saying, because it is difficult work. And the first one I held, it was raining and cold, and I couldn't believe we had 100 people show up. So it's really amazing that, people do want to give back to the environment, and they do want to improve it. And, they might not be able to give $1,000, but they could easily give a couple hours. And that's what I found. And that, as you're saying, that's a match in your grants. That time is worth money. I'm all for the volunteer group.
That's awesome. And as we've been joined by Pete Seidel, our co-chair of the Best Restored Shores Awards. Pete, would you like to ask any questions?
One question off the top of my head is, what were the biggest hurdles that you felt you overcame?
So at sort of every turn, we wanted to use a new product that hadn't been used in New England before, called REEF balls, which were used in Florida, but they've never been, up in our area. So people said they would sink in the mud. I had people say they would freeze and crack open. There were others that thought they would be lifted out of the water and thrown into people's homes, et cetera. So, we had every kind of negative attitude possible. To the point where we had to put in just 2 reef balls first. So we ordered them from Florida. They brought them up on a truck, and we put them in the tidal zone, and there they were. They just sat there, and then we got permits to put more in. So it took a while to try to get people to see, yes, it looks different. Yes, it's behaving differently, and particularly if you don't know yourself. I wasn't certain. We did our homework and looked at wave trajectories and how the waves would react with the reef ball, et cetera. And it actually performed very close to what our models were predicting, but to try to, I guess, educate people about it was difficult. But then sort of the seeing is believing. So it was, in the end, it worked out, and people saw the benefit of it. And so it was a good sort of lesson learned, and you just have to be tenacious. If I could have just thrown in the towel at several points, but we just said, oh, let's try one more thing. Let's try, and as you say, adaptive management. When something doesn't work, take it out and try something else. We've done that many times too.
So not every project's the same. Right now, one of the biggest hurdles that we're having is getting materials because of COVID, things that are manufactured. I just put a fish ladder in last week for alewife to go up over a dam. And I had everything already fabricated and delivered to me in the spring. So I'm ready to go. COVID hit. We can't go forward right now until we get the approval from our governor. We can do these projects. We came back, we just put it in, and I needed more things fabricated. And unfortunately, the company I bought it from was out of business now due to COVID. So that's been kind of a challenge for us. But again, like Doug was saying earlier, flexibility. You have to kind of imagine what you can do and how you're going to do it, and rely on local resources and do things sometimes on the fly. I always embrace these 2 words, adaptive management. You've got to embrace those things, because when you're out there, it's not like it is on paper, that's for sure. And what you have in your engineering plans might not always work perfectly. It's not saying it's not going to work, but you might have to kind of tweak things as you go, and having that ability to do that has been very important.
But the big hurdle we had is that it was a rough season. We're out there last year during the entire month of November into December doing work. And so we're dealing not just with the fall energy that's common this time of year, but we're rapidly dropping temperatures in water. So that was a big challenge. So in the budget, one of the ways we adapt for that is that we got to say, we have to get this done. We're going to get very wet doing this. So instead of losing time, and we extended our work windows, but we spent more money in our protective gear. Everybody's wearing wetsuits. Everybody's, make sure they're protected from hypothermia and able to work longer periods of time safely and comfortably. So that's how you have to adapt some things. Sometimes it's a completely different thought process starts up to make it work. Building flotation devices on, that night at the hotel room, so you can use them the next day at the site. Prepping for 4 hours in the hotel room, so you're not wasting time on land doing stuff you could be doing elsewhere. Al, you could be doing also forever, but it's the same deal. It's whatever you can do, get ready for the next day. So my guys they have long days. They know when they come off the site, they're not done working that day. It's just the way it has to be for these projects sometimes.
I'd love to give our audience a chance to ask questions, because there's so many things that we've touched on and have failed to touch on, and maybe some of the audience questions we'll give you an opportunity to either expound on other issues or expand on something you've already mentioned. So let's turn this over to the live portion now.